Hey Meri, how are you? Do you have a mic?
Yeah. I have.
So for those of you that, for those here that don't know you, Meri, why don't you give a little intro of yourself and your journey so far?
Sure. Hi everybody. I'm Meri. My pronouns are she or they. I don't really give a fuck which you use. And I'm CTO at Pleo these days. I was previously CTO at Helix, at Monzo, and at Moo. But I started my career in a slightly weird way. I was at Procter & Gamble for the first 10 years, which is the world's biggest consumer goods company, and very much more the sort of corporate IT rather than engineering side of things. But left there realizing I was going to be a great IT professional and a terrible technologist, and that was the wrong way around for me. I have ADHD, and it shows in my career. So I'm also on Flagstone's board, on Stonewall's board. I chair the Lead Dev Conference, which is coming up in June for any of you who have eng managers or tech leads that you need to educate. It's worth having a look at. And I'm an advisor to a VC in London called Kindred, who practice equitable venture. So yeah, that's my...
Thank you, Meri. I actually missed something out in my intro, which I got told to say. We do have Slido. So if you want to ask questions to Meri, so the latter half of this is dedicated to asking questions. Are we able to get up the QR code on screen? Let's just have a look. It might pop up behind me in just a sec. And if you can't get Slido up, just somewhere halfway through, raise your hand and we'll come around and get questions from you. There we go. There's an example. What's the best thing about being a CTO? I think that's an example question. So if you scan that QR code, where is it now? There. You'll be able to ask questions to Meri throughout the session. Okay. So one thing forgotten. At the first CTO Craft conference, somewhere way back in 2020, I remember there was this really great talk on imposter syndrome. And our audience, and I think the interesting thing about CTOs, yourself, myself included, is we've all got this variety of backgrounds, yet we all think we've comp sci and became a tech lead and engineering manager and then a VP, and then we had to wait for our CTO to retire and we got CTO. How do you think your background prepared you for your first tech leader role?
So I think the main thing that the first 10 years at P&G gave me was an extraordinary amount of commercial understanding. Probably a lot less technical. I mean, I was a dev briefly and then an architect, but I was a product and project and program manager for a lot of my time there. And so I think the commercial and business understanding was the thing that was very different and unusual. So I talk about it sometimes like I had an upside down career. I did all of the more commercial and business side early, and then had to get back closer to the tech later on. And that combination has been interesting. It makes me better as an all-round exec, and much better able to connect with my colleagues in the exec team. But I think that it means that I end up doing a lot more translating than I might have done otherwise.
What do you think the challenges were like when you came into sort of a CTO role through the more commercial route?
I mean, I think combination of coming from that more commercial route and also being a woman, people assume that I'm not technical, which is frankly hilarious. I sometimes, when I do talks, I start with the fact that I built part of South Africa's first satellite as a teenager, which, having built sold something that went into space when I was 16 tends to help a little bit with people assuming I'm not technical. But yeah, I think people tend to underestimate how technical I am because they see the commercial side a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. What's the sort of strategy you use to go about plugging those challenges, either through communication or?
I mean, I get very involved in the kind of architecture board wherever I'm working, and my, you shouldn't, like we're not meant to have favorite children, right? We're not meant to have favorite employees, but my sort of principal engineers and my architects tend to be the ones I most enjoy spending time with. So I think that kind of shows in the day-to-day over time.
Yeah. You've got an enviable sort of CV resume. Like, staying with how broad the CTO role can be in different jobs. How is your role, or how is your role as CTO of Pleo now different from when you were CTO of Monzo, which is different from maybe when you were CTO of Moo?
Yeah, so Moo and Monzo and Helix as well were all hyperscaling journeys. Yeah. So they were triple or quadruple or 5x the team in a year kind of journeys. So the thing I'm enjoying the most about Pleo right now is that I've got 250 people, and that's not growing massively month on month or year on year. Having a stable team and being able to just really focus on helping them be more productive and skilled up and delivering more and more every month rather than adjusting to new people coming in every 5 minutes is really, really enjoyable.
And how do you prepare yourself for like the differences in culture between those environments?
A lot of it at interview stage is like really digging into how the culture is different, how the values are different, and being sure that it's a match. I think I bring some different things, and being sure that those differences are going to be seen as a feature rather than a bug is a lot of the point of the interview process for me.
I think that's I think when we're looking for work, we're always, it's almost like you want the thing because you're investing the time in the thing, and actually having those flags is to say, this is the flag that makes me say no to this, even though the opportunity might be the right one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this time when I joined Pleo, I'd actually been out sick with long COVID for an extended period, and so it's the first time in many years that I did a real full look at the market and interviewed in a dozen places and really made a very active decision about specifically where I was going. And I think it's fair to say I learned a lot from some maybe lack of due diligence around culture in a couple of previous roles that made a big difference, made me pay a lot more attention to that this time around.
Talking with roles, there's a sort of trend that I've noticed in some of the CTO, I was going to say groups, but it's really drinks, that I'm a member of. Well, I guess this is a segue into the differences between sort of a permanent CTO role and how you would look at that different to, say, an interim CTO role or a fractional CTO role. What to you are the differences and how would you evaluate them differently?
So I think one of the things that's different when you're in a perm role is that people believe that they believe you're there for the long run, even if you maybe you're only thinking of being there for a couple of years. And it's a lot easier to build your team, I think, because people think that they're joining you and they're joining the mission that you're on. I have also done interim roles where, I'd say the difference between interim and fractional is interim tends to be at a place for a certain number of days a week and be quite a significant chunk of your time on a temporary basis, where fractional is having a whole portfolio of companies that you're CTOing for. There's different definitions, of course, though. I have gone the interim and fractional route a couple of times in my career, and every time I do it, I enjoy it for the first 9 months, and then I have this moment where I'm like, shit, did I retire early? And I really miss having my own team, and so I tend to keep going back to being a perm CTO because I miss that kind of building a team, going on a mission together piece.
I think that's right. I think, I've just come from interim, and I think the heartbreaking thing about interim is you get kicked out.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've had this, but you get this sort of like, oh, would you go permanent? It's like, no, it's a very different role when you go permanent. And the thing with interim is it's got to end. Yeah. Whereas the thing with permanent is it ends when you're ready, I think. So, I think our role as CTOs is not only difficult because technology changes, but I think the role has changed, certainly the 15 years I've done it, and will change as the environment we work in changes. What are the big changes you've seen and how have you adapted?
I think we've started to have a much more equal seat at the table than we used to. We used to be the sort of techie in the corner who made sure shit didn't blow up too badly. And I think now tech is such a driver of that business value that we're right in the center of things, and where before you maybe had to try and convince your executive colleagues to give a shit, now they're desperate to understand and they're like, hey, could we use AI for this or could we use AI for that? And doing that translation job is a much bigger part of the role, I think. So I think we've become more equal executives, and I think we've become much more strategic to the theme of the conference today. I think you're making decisions that are very crucial to the future of the business and the success of the business, which, it's not that long ago that CTO reported to CIO, reported
Yeah.
to CFO, right?
That's one of my red flags.
Yeah.
It's like,
I think reporting into the CFO is, I love CFOs, they're some of my favorite people, but as a boss is not a positive sign.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think everyone should write that down. If your first interviews with the CFO, maybe just walk away.
If they're going to be your boss, if
Yeah.
the first interview's with the CFO and they're going to be a peer, it's all right. It's all right.
Yeah. There's a question that's popped on screen, but it's actually a question I've got written down. But in terms of the role, like, what do you think the biggest challenge tech is? What do you think is the biggest challenge tech in general is currently facing? Maybe let's go in the short term rather than long term.
Right now, I think it's two things on very opposite ends of the spectrum: security and AI. And I think AI is. I'm from an AI background. It's a field that I've loved and seen develop with great glee over the last few years. But I think people having unrealistic expectations of AI is one of the kind of challenges we're having to navigate. And then just the increasing risk around security is the other end of the scale that I think is so much more of our job now than it was a few years ago.
Yeah, let's sticking with the security quite operational, I guess. Like, how have you started to think about building that into the role, and what sort of things are you like? This is a red flag, and actually, this is how I like to look at it now.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in security, as in many things, the sort of shift left paradigm is really important. So making secure by design, how do you make your developer experience and your way of building include security from the get-go? I think red flags are things like completely separate security teams, or security teams that are a blocker to getting things in production, or a final check before anything else gets done. Those tend to be pretty worrying signs. Or super tiny security teams in big organizations. I think you've got hundreds of engineers and you've got 2 security people, then they're both going to burn out, and they're probably not going to be able to do the role that the organization needs them to do.
And what challenge? Like, I think for me, it's getting it, much like us getting it a seat at the table, but then trying to build that narrative in what everybody does. It was very much of a view years ago that it was everybody's job. I don't think I have that view now. I think it should be somebody's job.
Yeah.
I
think it's somebody's job, but it's everybody's responsibility. And I think so helping everybody be able to be responsible and be responsible in both the kind of accountability way, but also in the sensible, responsible way is important. And there's not necessarily that many security professionals that think about it that way.
Yeah.
Think, how do I equip hundreds of engineers to develop in a secure way, to be part of the security mission? I don't think something that a lot of folks think that way.
Yeah, that's true. Staying with the short term, I guess, we've just come from 4 years of a pandemic, and certainly 2 years ago, I genuinely feel like our job sucked. The talent had dried up in the market. The salaries being paid were phenomenal. Thanks Google, Facebook, et al. How do you see that changing over the short term?
I mean, the massive swath of tech layoffs is obviously changing the environment quite a bit. I've got an organization right now who are like, inflation's at 10%. Why aren't I getting a 10% pay rise? And I'm like, because the market. And that's kind of tough for folks on the ground to understand, I think. But I think we're seeing a very different talent pool than we're used to. We're seeing a lot more people available than we used to see. But again, their expectations are incredibly high because they've been at Google, Facebook, and well, I forget what it used to be FANG, right? And it's something else now because everybody changed their name to something different.
I haven't even got TikTok on my phone. I don't know. I guess the thing I'm hoping is retention. Like, it's certainly a lot of the faster businesses I was working in, like the amount I would see teams bounce for no reason aside from that's 30K more and we're not going to keep people. The other reflection or aspect to that is the drying up of venture capital. Not for Pleo, but like just in general for the people you spoke to, like how is that sort of changing the role, and how have we got to be a bit prepared for that?
I mean, I think it's switching the focus to how profitable is your business rather than just how fast can it grow very, very rapidly. There was a hilarious, I think it was Sequoia, doing a very like super basic like positive cash flow, what does it mean, slide deck that came out about a year ago, which I just thought, as someone with the background I've got, was just kind of hilarious. Like the thought of having an exec who can't read a P&L is just a fascinating concept to me. But it's very, sorry, that made me sound like a twat. But like, I don't think it in a bad way. It's amazing to me that that there are people who could have grown businesses and gotten so far into the life cycle of a business without it needing to be profitable is kind of amazing. We're exiting this period where capital was basically free, and it's really not free anymore. You can get a 5% return on cash these days. Why would you put your money into VC where it's so much more uncertain?
Yeah, right.
So it's a very, very different world than we've been used to. And there's lots of people who their whole career has been in the boom time. They've never seen a recession. They've never gone through a layoff. They've never seen a downturn before. And it's not their fault that they haven't. We had 15, 20 good years, right?
Yeah.
And it's.
And I think like just having those job interviews where the principal question is how many engineers can you get in the building? Yeah. Versus like I can build you a really good engineering team or a really good product, but if you just want people, I can find people.
Yeah.
And I think that's hopefully a significant shift because I hate recruiting. It really sucks.
See, I quite enjoy recruiting. I enjoy building the teams, but I think creating the space in which people can be really good at their job is a much more exciting part of it, and it makes recruiting much more fun. If you've created a great environment, then recruiting into it is much more easy than it is when you're trying to get people to sign up to a arduous journey.
I've actually seen you talk about dev culture. That like how do you do that especially if you go into a new company and you sort of think about your first few months? Like how do you build a culture that you can go out and sell to people that have worked for you before, or even just to the labor market as it is?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Dan Pink's Drive, which is all about modern motivation, and he talks about purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And one of the things that I realized I'm a nerd, right? So I have a favorite management book. It's First Break All the Rules, because First Break All the Rules is hugely data-based. And if you look at First Break All the Rules, it's got the sort of 12 questions that predict high-performing teams, but also happy teams. And almost all of those questions, some of them are about purpose, some of them are about autonomy, but almost all of them are about mastery. And so I think a hugely important thing is to frame for people how they're going to develop as an engineer, as a manager, and similar. And so showing that you're going to be able to develop that mastery is really important. And then I think what's missing from Dan Pink's model is inclusion, that feeling of community, that feeling of I can be myself and be successful here. And that letting a broad enough group of people feel like they can be themselves and be successful is really important. I think that last one is a lot about role modeling. If you see I've worked places where the leadership team looked like they not only shared a haircut and a tie, but probably were wearing matching underwear as well. I remember an all hands where somebody, it's going to be very easy to figure out which company this was. Anyway, there was a campaign going on about doing something for the first time, and they made the mistake of asking these extraordinarily bland looking guys what they were going to do for the first time. And the first one said, cook a meal for my family. He'd never done that in his 50 years. And then the second one said the laundry, and the whole room just went, ooh. And the poor woman who was leading diversity and inclusion had a line at the next break lining up to her. And I remember I was sat next to her and I just leaned over and I was like, so Tina, I think it's a good thing that I have a wife, but she needs to stop with this designing hospitals bullshit. My wife's an architect. Go home and do my laundry and cook me dinner, right? And she was just sat with her head in her hands. But I think that it's not necessarily that you're always going to find an exact role model, right? Like, I'm the one that Daily Mail warns you about. I'm a woman, I'm non-binary, I'm an immigrant with a job, which I think is worse than if I were living off the state, but I have to check the headlines to be sure. And I'm neurodiverse, and I'm physically disabled, and I'm queer, and my wife is British. I'm over here stealing your women and your jobs. So, I have never found someone who is a direct role model in all of those ways for me. But I think it's really indicative of, are the leadership in a company different enough from each other that it's evident that different routes to success are possible.
Good. You mentioned one of my favorite books, First Break All the Rules. And I think just as a title, it's worth just keeping that in your head sometimes.
Yeah.
I similar to you, I started off, I did 10 years of corporate strategy and sort of had to closet my nerdiness.
Yeah.
When you go through that, I think you get a certain amount of indoctrination to, I think what the technical term is bullshit. What were the sort of management theories that you sort of threw out and challenged and sort of maverick your way through in a CTO role now, ignoring or shouting about?
Yeah. So I think thinking that you've got to tell everybody what to do is the most fundamentally bullshit one.
Yeah.
I think the most dangerous thing we can believe is that we know what the right thing is, or that we're technically correct. When bluntly, if you've been in a leadership or management role for more than about 18 months, you're probably fucking wrong about the tech by this point, right? And not accepting that, not leaning into that, I think is a major, major mistake that's still very common, but I think it's a real mistake. And then there's so many others. Focusing on your weaknesses rather than your strengths, trying to fill every gap rather than trying to be brilliant at the things that you're good at. There's so many more that I think are just...
I think the filling gap, like that's something I only learned recently, and just, I was chatting to someone about getting a new role, and he's like, obviously the first week I've got to rebuild my network. And I'm like, well, why would you do that? And it's like, well, this is a different role. I need different people around me. I was like, that's really smart. I should do that. So we've got plenty of upvoted questions on the screen. So the top one, given the size of your organization, how do you keep in the loop with what's happening in your teams and squads?
So what I did when I first joined, I joined at a point there was also a new chief product officer, and we went round and we met every squad. And we had a session with every squad in the business and basically asked them what they were proud of, what was blocking them, and then if we had a magic wand, what could we fix for them? And that was massively insightful. We do that every 6 months. It's a big investment of time. There's 50-odd teams, but we find that it's really, really worth doing. And then the other side is I've got 2 very good VPs of Eng who have Eng managers under them, and then we have it's the first time I've had this actually, but there's an Eng manager embedded in every team at Pleo. Which means I have some folks who've got like 3 reports, which I'm not sure is the most sensible thing in the world. But it does mean that there's a real network that's very aware of what's going on the ground. And at Pleo we have support meetings. So rather than having a steering meeting or anything else, we literally frame it as a support meeting. So each squad or team has one, and then that bubbles up into domains. I don't tend to attend the individual team ones, but I'll attend the domain ones, and then things bubble up into there. So the other thing that I do is I do regular, usually Slido style, so people can ask anonymous questions, Q&As, and that tells me a lot of what people are freaked out about or what they're worried about. Sometimes the level of snark that you get in an anonymous Q&A tells you an awful lot about how the culture's going. And then we have Peakon, so we do a kind of very regular employee survey as well.
I love that dissonance between what you get asked or what gets communicated to you anonymously. My big thing is skip levels, and it's always the shocker, especially slightly old school company where people are like, why do you want to speak to my team? Like, why wouldn't I want to speak? They're nerds, they're cool.
Yeah.
So that dissonance I think is really fascinating. Gives you a good temperature check. I go to the next one. So it says, you mentioned you have ADHD. How does that impact your day-to-day working life?
So I didn't know I had ADHD until relatively recently. I got diagnosed in 2019. I think the way that it impacted my daily life up until then was that I was extraordinarily reliant on caffeine. I was self-medicating to an extent that I just hadn't understood. I only found out I had ADHD because I gave up caffeine for 6 months because I wasn't sleeping, and became basically useless, which was not a fun experience. I was not very productive at all without coffee. And so, but looking back, it's affected me in a couple of ways. I am incredibly deadline driven, and I tend to be very busy so that something is always urgent. I'm not very good at doing things if there is ample time and ample room to do it. I need there to be some urgency. So I have typically filled my life and my my work life and my other life to the brim, so that something is always urgent. And that tends to be the way that it pans out. Really, like, to be very open, though, the other way that it affects me is that I benefit a lot from having a good EA, and I struggle a lot if I have a shit EA. And I've been at the level that I've usually got an executive assistant for quite a long time, and so I'm quite reliant on that at this point. I think earlier in my career I had to be very structured about managing my calendar and my email and my time and booking out, beginning of the day, middle of the day, end of the day, to keep up with all of the inboxes and things like that. But at this point I'm lucky enough to be able to outsource that a little bit.
So next question up, and thank you for that one. I think that's advice just for all of us rather than just ADHD. I think that's I have a bad day if I don't do that.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. So do you seek to balance the commercial and technical sides in the culture of your team? How do you maintain the team culture during periods of large growth? Maybe the first question actually first.
Yeah. So I think in balancing the technical and the commercial, the sort of route through that I found is customer focus. And so I really love when engineers care about the end customer and understand the end customer. So attending user research sessions, being in the reviews with product managers to understand whether features are having the impact that we wanted them to have, those kinds of things I think are really important. And I think it's more fulfilling to do engineering and development work when you understand how it's going to be used. That connection with your end user is really important. And if your business is set up in a sensible way, then hopefully what's good for your users is also good for the company. I know that that's not always the case, but I'm lucky enough that it is. And so I think that rather than trying to get a bunch of engineers to care about commercial factors, I try to get them to care about the customer. And then as long as the customer needs are in line with commercial success, then it all works out in the end.
How do you deal? I've certainly gone into companies, usually it's a cultural transformation rather than their product makes no money. How do you go in when you do have those engineers that are like, I don't care about customers, just tell me what to do. Just write the ticket and tell me what to do.
They don't tend to last all that long in my organizations, is the honest answer. I think that there's some folks who they've got that as almost like a trauma response, that they just, they don't know any way of interacting other than like, give me the ticket, I will write the code. And so I think usually I try to work with the product managers and engineering managers and designers to make it a more holistic process for the whole team to be involved, because like engineers have good ideas too. They shouldn't be not allowed or unable to contribute to solving the problem. And I think that requires you to get to the point where you're giving a team a problem to solve rather than a solution to deliver. And that's the most important thing from a cultural perspective, but also just from an operational perspective, is to switch that around so that people aren't focused on delivering the solution, they're just focused on delivering the impact.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually sometimes that's not persuading the engineers, it's persuading everybody else to let them have a crack at it. So next one, so you talked about due diligence. This might be our last one, Meri. So due diligence on culture before joining somewhere. How do you go about this in practice? What sort of things you look for?
I interview them as much as they're interviewing me is one of the things. I find out what the company's purported values are, and then I ask questions about how they come to life in the day-to-day. So one of PLEO's values is transparency, which is not an unusual one to have, but I went into quite a lot of detail with the CEO about what that actually meant. Does everybody know how the company is doing? Does everybody know what the runway is? They do. They know we've got 3 years and then we need to be profitable by then and that kind of stuff. And so I think a lot of it is that kind of interviewing, but also trying to meet people who are like on the ground and seeing what they think is challenging and what they think is good is really helpful in that regard. So making sure that you don't only meet the execs or only meet the senior people is important. And in fairness, there's some companies that they just haven't thought that you'll want to meet some of the people on the ground. So it's not necessarily a red flag that they don't pre-arrange it, but if they react badly when you ask about it, that's often a little bit of a worrying sign.
Yeah, I've been refused. But it's usually for weird outgoing CTO or they've messed something up or something. But to me, that's a red flag, I think. And Glassdoors are great. The reviews on Glassdoor, that they come with a nuance and a context, but signals are always important in that type of data.
Although I think that the fact that so many companies have had to do layoffs and so few of the tech community have been used to the idea of layoffs has made Glassdoor a little less useful in the sort of last year and a half or so, because there's so many people who are so angry about a business reality that it's sort of muddying the water a little bit. But I agree, in general, it's a good signal.
Yeah. So we're sort of at time. One last one for me. So we've talked about First Break All the Rules. What are the other 2 books that you recommend to sort of new upcoming leaders now?
I love Let My People Go Surfing, which is which is a good pick. What's the other one the other one that I really recommend, it's not the easiest read, but is Talent is Overrated, which is about how people learn and how skills are developed. Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers is a sort of glossier, easier to read version, but Talent is Overrated is a really great read if you can get through it. It's a little dry, but it's very, very, very useful.
Good stuff. Well, look, Meri, thank you so much for your questions. There's still questions popping up, so grab Meri during the break.
I just quickly, I have to apologize. I have to run off to a board meeting, so I'm not staying, but I am on Twitter. I'm geek_manager. The poor guy who hasn't got the underscore gets some weird questions for me occasionally. So geek_manager, please feel free to ask me on Twitter. I'm very happy to answer there, and I'm very sorry that I can't stick around for the whole day.
Good stuff. Meri, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.